Sobibor was one of 3 extermination centers created by the Nazis as part of Operation Reinhard. Although for decades it was the least investigated, the available data confirms that its purpose was solely to eliminate human beings. Some 170,000 people were murdered there in just 18 months. The German authorities attempted to wipe it off the map and eliminate all traces of what had happened there. For many years, its history remained obscure. Neither structures nor many documents survived. However, over time, witnesses, archival fragments, and artifacts emerged that helped reconstruct the events. How did an extermination camp created solely for killing really operate? And why did almost no one know what happened there for decades? The secret work that prepared the extermination camp, Sobibor extermination camp, was selected by Richard Tomala, an SS construction chief with experience in previous projects. The site was part of a wooded area near the village of the same name in the Lublin region of eastern Poland. The site was remote, sparsely populated, and well connected to the railway. This location made it easy to maintain the secrecy of what would happen there. Tomala was in charge of planning and coordinating the work from the beginning. Upon his arrival in March 1942, he found an undeveloped area. Trees were cut down, and the area where the camp facilities would later be located was leveled. Jewish laborers brought from nearby ghettos, especially from Siedlce, were employed for this task. Many of them were artisans, laborers, or forced laborers who were unaware of the true purpose of the project. Work began under armed guard. The workers dug trenches, erected wooden and barbed wire fences, and prepared the foundations for the first buildings. Most of the structures were made from simple materials, such as wood and sheet metal. The tools were basic and the work pace was steady under the direct supervision of SAS men and Ukrainian auxiliaries. The weather was not conducive. Spring rains turned the ground into a quagmire, which delayed the work. Even so, progress was made quickly, as orders were to complete the camp as quickly as possible. Barracks, offices, warehouses, and other spaces necessary for the operation were built. Everything was functionally laid out, although key elements such as the gas chambers were still missing. Tomala applied what he learned at Belzec to avoid mistakes. For example, he planned an internal railway from the outset so that trains could enter the camp directly. This would avoid delays and allow transport to avoid stopping at external stations. He also considered internal access points, traffic paths, and separation zones between the different parts of the complex. One of the first tasks was to camouflage the construction so that it would go unnoticed from the outside. Branches, earth, and vegetation were used to cover certain areas, and the use of heavy machinery was limited. The goal was for any observer from outside to see only trees and common ground. The local population was not allowed to approach, and traffic restrictions were imposed in the surrounding area. The train station was slightly modified to fulfill its function within the camp. A small platform was built, and the tracks were adapted to allow cars to enter easily. This infrastructure was integrated with the rest of the region's railway system, which would facilitate transfers from different ghettos or concentration points. To separate the camp's various functions, the grounds were divided into several areas. Although not all the elements had yet been installed, separate sectors for SS personnel, prisoner workers, and extermination zones were already planned. This organization would be essential for maintaining order and control once the camp was operational. The Jewish workers who participated in the project were under constant threat. Some were replaced after just a few days, others were killed upon completion. There were no guarantees, and although in some cases they were promised better treatment or rations, in practice they received no different conditions than the other prisoners. The camp's basic facilities were ready in just a few weeks. The roofs, gates, fences, and watchtowers were assembled according to a pre-designed scheme. There was no improvisation. Each structure had a clear purpose: accommodation, control, surveillance, storage. The facilities were not yet in use, but everything indicated that they would be operational very soon. Tests were conducted with small convoys to verify the operation of the internal track. These trials allowed for fine-tuning the entry system, parking, unloading cars, and managing the flow of people. The tests were successful. The SS confirmed they could handle large transports without the need for outside support or visible delays. Tomala considered his task complete once the basic operation of the complex was verified. He left the site in charge of Franz Stangl, an Austrian officer who had participated in previous elimination programs such as T4. With his arrival, the focus shifted from construction to perfecting the extermination mechanism. From that moment on, work focused on the final details. Key areas were completed, access was improved, internal flows were defined, and sensitive areas were sealed off. The goal was to have everything ready for continuous operation with no margin for error. The physical infrastructure was already complete. All that remained was to put it into operation. The 3 zones of the countryside: work, deception, and death. Sobibor camp was divided into 3 main zones, each of which formed separate yet interconnected units. Each of these areas had its own specific function within the camp and was surrounded by wooden fences and barbed wire. Visual barriers, such as fences covered with branches, also existed to prevent one section from seeing what was happening in another. The first zone, called Camp 1, was located near the main entrance. It housed prisoners selected for labor. These men and women performed tasks such as cleaning, maintenance, sorting personal belongings, and providing logistical support. The barracks were simple, made of wood, and had no insulation. This area also housed the kitchen, clothing storage, and workshops where items were repaired or tools needed for internal work were made. Access to Camp 1 was restricted. Only prisoners with permission or accompanied by guards were allowed in. SS members also had facilities in this area, their own mess hall, command offices, and individual rooms. The Ukrainian auxiliaries, on the other hand, slept in separate, more rudimentary barracks away from the main building. Next to Camp Y was the unloading area, the part of the camp where trains loaded with deportees arrived. There was a makeshift platform built next to the tracks, where new arrivals were ordered to disembark and form lines. From there, they were directed toward what was known as the transit area. This area acted as a waiting area, while giving them the false impression that they were at a way station or a registration site. Trains arrived directly inside the camp thanks to a secondary track that had been built for this purpose. This line connected to the local Sobibor station, which in turn joined the regional rail network. The final section allowed the cars to stop right at the disembarkation site, thus avoiding visual contact with the outside world. This also limited opportunities for escape or panic among the prisoners. Opposite Camp 1 was Camp 2. This area was the logistical heart of the camp. There, the victims' confiscated belongings were sorted. Clothing, jewelry, documents, utensils, food, money, and other items were collected and stored. There were special barracks where Jewish workers sorted and packaged each item following SS instructions. Some of the loot was sent directly to Germany, while some was recycled within the camp. Camp 2 also housed a small post office and a room where letters supposedly written by prisoners were forged to be sent to their families as part of the systematic deception. These texts were dictated or written under duress and were used as propaganda to convince the recipients that their loved ones were safe. Between Camp 2 and the most secret part of the complex was a long, curved corridor known as the Tube. This corridor was a fenced path, covered on both sides with branches and planks, which prevented people from seeing out or escaping. Its purpose was to transport the victims from the arrival area to the gas chambers without them knowing what was happening. The tube had no turns or forks. Once entered, there was no going back. At the end of the tube was Camp 3, the most restricted and lethal part of the complex. No one other than SS or Sonderkommando personnel was allowed inside. Even the Ukrainian guards avoided that area. Camp 3 was completely enclosed and guarded. It contained the gas chambers, mass graves, and later improvised crematoria. The gas chambers were simple, rustic-looking structures made of common materials like wood and brick. From the outside, they were indistinguishable from a normal shed. Their interior was divided into small rooms where the victims were piled up. A pipe in the ceiling connected to a motor that injected carbon monoxide produced by a repurposed tank engine. This gas caused death by asphyxiation within minutes. Next to the chambers were the barracks of the Sonderkommando, the group of prisoners forced to perform tasks within Camp 3. Their work included removing corpses, searching for hidden valuables, and transporting them to the graves. These men knew their fate was the same, only postponed. They lived in isolation, without contact with the other prisoners in the camp. The graves were dug in advance by machinery brought for that purpose. They were deep and wide, prepared to receive thousands of bodies. At first, the bodies were simply buried. But later, for reasons of hygiene and concealment, it was decided to incinerate them. For this purpose, grills made from train rails and firewood were placed over trenches. The bodies were stacked and set on fire in shifts. Camp 3 was designed so that no one would see what was happening there. The fences were covered, the routes were isolated, and the workers who passed through the tube did so without knowing where they were going. There were no obvious signs or noises. Everything was done in a controlled and silent manner to avoid collective reactions that would complicate the process. In addition to these 3 main areas, the camp had other smaller facilities scattered around. There was a registration office, a punishment cell, warehouses, control booths, and small fake gardens used to maintain an orderly appearance. Everything was arranged in a functional manner. The goal was to ensure that operations could be carried out without interruptions and with as little contact as possible between the different units. The camp's perimeter was surrounded by several lines of defense. The outermost was a barbed wire fence, followed by a ditch and a line of posts. Buried mines were placed in some areas to prevent escape attempts. There were also watchtowers with full visibility over the internal routes. From there, armed guards could shoot anyone suspected of moving outside their assigned area. Each part of the camp had its own routine, but all were connected in a system that functioned like a chain. From the arrival of the trains, through the tube, to elimination in the chambers and the handling of the bodies, everything followed a daily cycle. There were no breaks. The SS sought maximum efficiency, with minimal expense and without leaving any traces. The forced laborers operating in Camp 1 and Camp 2 knew there was a forbidden area beyond the tube, but they didn't know the details. Some sensed it, others preferred not to ask. The SS maintained the secret with constant threats and immediate punishments. Everything was designed to dehumanize and control. The organization of the camp, with its precise division of tasks and spaces, was the result of cold, practical planning. This was not an improvised site, but an installation designed to carry out a specific objective: to eliminate thousands of people without noise, without evidence, and without the possibility of resistance. The arrival. The trains transporting deportees to Sobibor arrived directly on the camp's inner track. The journey could last hours or even days in closed freight cars with no ventilation or room to move. The passengers were packed like cargo. Some died on the journey from lack of oxygen, water, or extreme heat. Neither the destination nor the length of the journey was reported. Most didn't know where they were going or why. Upon arrival, the trains would stop at the platform inside the camp. Guards would shout orders, the gates would be opened, and people would be forced to get off quickly. There was no time to ask questions. Those unable to move were dragged out or abandoned. Dogs would bark, whips would whistle, and Ukrainian soldiers would watch their every step. The new arrivals were lined up in groups. They were asked to leave their belongings piled on the ground. They were promised they would be retrieved later. An SS member or a Jewish translator would explain that they were in a transit camp and would be sent to new work sites. This lie was part of the system to maintain calm. In reality, most would be killed within a few hours. Men and women were separated. A quick search was also conducted to identify people with useful trades, such as tailors, carpenters, shoemakers, or doctors. These few were set aside and temporarily assigned to the work group. The rest were sent directly through the tube to the extermination zone. Children, the elderly, and the sick had no chance of being selected. The process was designed to be swift and seamless. Once one train was unloaded, the next was already on its way. The station was never empty. The staff worked tirelessly to keep pace. The SS kept track of times and corrected any delays. Punishments were meted out if anything didn't go as expected. Abandoned belongings were collected by selected prisoners. Clothing, suitcases, food, money, and documents were taken to the sorting warehouses. Nothing was lost. Everything was recorded and separated. Some personal belongings were kept as evidence or as loot, depending on their value. Efficiency was absolute. The guards kept some of the money or valuables, while the rest was packaged for shipment to Germany. New arrivals, upon getting off the train, saw an environment that didn't seem particularly threatening. There were trees all around, wooden buildings, a clean platform, and people in uniform giving orders. The station sign read Sobibor, as if it were just any rural stop. This initial image lessened suspicion. Excessive shouting or visible violence was avoided, at least in the first few minutes. The men and women were then taken in separate directions. The women were told they were going to shower and that they should undress for disinfection. Benches were placed for them to sit on, and they were given fake towels. Everything was arranged to maintain the illusion of normalcy until the last moment. The same procedure was applied to the men if they weren't selected for work. Once inside the tube, the atmosphere changed. That narrow, covered corridor created a sense of confinement. There were no windows or exits. The screams diminished. The silence was forced. Some began to suspect, but it was too late. The march continued, urged on by the guards. People walked in single file, unaware that the gas chambers were at the end of the path. Those selected for labor didn't receive much better treatment. They were separated and taken to Camp 1, where they slept in unheated and unsanitary barracks. They were assigned tasks according to need, sorting objects, cleaning, cooking, maintenance, or helping in the extermination areas. Their life expectancy was longer, but not certain. Many were replaced after days or weeks, killed in secret and replaced by new ones. Some trains arrived with informed people who suspected what was going to happen. This generated tension. There were screams, cries, or even resistance. In those cases, the guards responded with immediate violence. Shots were fired without warning. Whips and rifle butts were used. Calm had to be maintained at all costs. The SS did not allow the trial to be disrupted by emotional breakdowns or disorder. There were cases of people trying to flee after getting off the train. They were chased, beaten, or shot. Others fainted, refused to move, or were paralyzed by fear. All of this was anticipated. The guards had clear instructions on how to act. Nothing could stop the flow of the system. Every step was calculated. The station where the arrival took place was fake but effective. The deceptive elements included signs, clocks, painted walls, and even staff posing as train employees. A temporary illusion was created that it was merely a stop, a formality. This resource was used until the last moment to avoid riots or chaos. The trains arrived from different parts of Poland and other occupied countries. Sometimes they were large convoys with dozens of cars. Other times they were smaller transports. The frequency depended on decisions from Central Command and the camp's capacity at the time. There were always logistics in place to receive them. The entire process of arrival, separation, classification, and transfer was completed in a matter of hours. No delays were allowed. Once completed, the camp was cleaned, the barracks were organized, belongings were stored, and the next train was awaited. It was a repetitive, impersonal, and perfectly synchronized routine. The deadly farce of the gas chambers. The gas chambers were the core of Sobibor's extermination system. Their construction began shortly after the camp's basic structures were completed. They were designed to kill large groups in a short time, leaving no room for resistance. Their outward appearance was ordinary, similar to that of any rural shed or warehouse, which helped maintain the deception until the very end. Initially, 3 small gas chambers were erected, placed side by side with a common access room. The building was made of simple materials, wooden walls, sloping tin roofs, with no external signs indicating its purpose. Inside, they were closed spaces, with an airtight door and a slit connected to the gas system. They had no windows or openings. The gas used was carbon monoxide, generated by the engine of a captured Soviet tank. That engine ran outside the building, and its gases were channeled through pipes into the chambers. The process was crude but effective. Within minutes, everyone inside died of asphyxiation. Technicians made sure the engine was running before filling the room with people. The prisoners working at Camp 3, under the direct supervision of the SS, were in charge of operating the system under orders. They opened and closed the doors, supervised entry, and removed the bodies afterward. They had no choice. Any disobedience meant immediate death. They lived in isolation, with no contact with the outside world and no hope of survival. The group responsible for operating the engine and controlling the gas was carefully selected. They received brief training and then were forced to repeat the task every day. The engine's noise could be heard from inside the camp, but because everything was so well separated, newcomers never associated it with anything lethal. The victims were taken to the chambers in groups after passing through the tube. They were told they were going to shower. Sometimes they were given towels, bars of soap, or instructions on how to hang their clothes neatly. They were instructed to remember where they left their belongings so they could retrieve them later. This illusion was maintained until the moment the door was closed. Once inside, the room was packed. The guards forced their way in so there were no gaps. No protests or delays were allowed. When the door closed, the gas was quickly introduced. Within minutes, screams, bangs, and then silence were heard. The engine operator kept the system on for a certain amount of time until he was sure that everyone was dead. Sonderkommando members entered wearing masks and began emptying the room. They removed the bodies and stacked them outside, next to the mass grave or the incineration grates. Before that, they had to check each body for gold teeth, hidden jewelry, or documents. This task was mandatory. Any items found were handed over to the SS officers. The entire process, from the group's arrival to the final cleaning, could take 1 or 2 hours. Then the chamber was aired, cleaned, and prepared for the next group. There were days when this cycle was repeated more than 10 times. The machinery never stopped. The death was constant, organized, and without margin for error. At some point, the initial 3 chambers were deemed insufficient. The number of trains increased, and with them, the number of people arriving at the camp. The SS decided to expand the facility. A new building was constructed with larger, better sealed, and more efficient chambers. This new structure could process up to 600 people at a time. The new extermination facility was built next to the original chambers, but was larger and better equipped. It had reinforced walls, sturdier doors, and a ventilation system that allowed the air to be cleared more quickly between groups. The number of rooms was also increased. There were now 6 gas chambers connected to a single motor that distributed the gas through metal conduits. The building's design sought to improve the pace of executions. The entrance was wider, the access corridor was covered, and bottlenecks were eliminated. Deportees were guided from the tube to a waiting room where they were asked to strip, hand over their valuables, and await instructions. Everything was arranged to avoid panic. The SS paid special attention to the body language and tone of voice of those giving orders. If anyone was aggressive or abrupt, they were replaced. The key was to maintain calm among the victims until the last moment. If there were signs of resistance or hesitation, swift action was taken to isolate the perpetrator and expedite the process. The waiting room simulated a locker room. There were numbered hangars, benches, and even a sign that said bathrooms. Everything was fake. Even plants and decorations were placed to reinforce the lie. The victims, confused by the environment, followed the instructions without suspecting. The deception worked thanks to routine and the pressure of the environment. When they were taken to the chambers, they were asked to enter in groups. The guards closed the door and activated the system. The running engine began pumping out carbon monoxide. There were no windows or openings. The gas filled the space. Deaths occurred from asphyxiation, disorientation, and respiratory collapse. Within minutes, it was all over. The heat inside the chamber, the lack of oxygen, and the overcrowding caused the bodies to be piled up, some in desperate positions. The Sonderkommando had to enter, separate them, and remove them one by one. It was exhausting and traumatic work. The bodies were dragged, inspected, and transferred to the pits or improvised ovens. Sometimes the chambers suffered technical failures. If the engine wouldn't start or if there were problems with the pipes, alternative methods were applied, such as using direct exhaust gases or prolonging the confinement until death from lack of air occurred. The operation was not suspended. Everything had to continue, regardless of the conditions. The smoke and odors emanating from the extermination area spread throughout the camp. Although attempts were made to hide them with plant barriers, the workers at Camp 1 and Camp 2 knew something was happening beyond the tube. Some sensed it. Others didn't want to know. The secret was kept secret with threats, beatings, and executions. Cleaning the chambers was quick. Buckets of water, brooms, and rags were used. The floor had to be free of blood or debris before the next group could be admitted. Everything was timed. The SS observed from outside and controlled every step of the process. If anyone was late or made mistakes, they were immediately replaced. The officers in charge of this section of the camp were usually selected for their efficiency and composure. They weren't improvised. They knew how to manage large groups, how to manipulate, and how to coordinate the stages of extermination without interruption. Some had previously worked in other camps or on euthanasia programs. The total number of people murdered in these chambers cannot be determined precisely, but it is estimated to have been in the hundreds of thousands. Each transport meant between 500 and 2,000 victims. On the busiest days, several trains were eliminated in succession. There were no detailed written records. The system required no paperwork. The gas chambers were the center of horror at Sobibor. The entire camp revolved around them. The trains, the forced laborers, the sorting of objects, the false promises, and the constant silence. They were the end of a carefully planned process where every detail sought to make mass murder more efficient. Forced to collaborate with death, this is what it was like to be in the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando at Sobibor was made up of selected prisoners forced to perform the most brutal tasks in the camp. They lived separately from the rest, under constant surveillance and with no option to refuse. Their work began the moment the bodies emerged from the gas chambers. These men were forced to open the chamber doors after each execution. The environment they encountered was stifling. The bodies were piled high, some intertwined in desperation. It took time to separate the corpses, which were heavy and sometimes in positions impossible to move. The heat, the stench, and the pressure were constant. Their mission wasn't just to remove the bodies, they also had to search them carefully. They looked for hidden objects such as rings, earrings, watches, or gold teeth. If they found anything, they handed it over to the SS. It was done mechanically. No body was allowed to be missed. The officers were on guard and demanded speed. Failure to do so could mean immediate execution. The gold teeth were removed with special pliers. If any member of the Sonderkommando hesitated or resisted, they were killed on the spot and replaced. The tools were rudimentary, and the process was painful to watch. It was all part of the system of dehumanization. The workers were expected to act like machines. The bodies were then transported from the building. Depending on the period, they were buried in mass graves or cremated. For cremation, metal grills constructed from rails were placed over deep trenches. There, the bodies were stacked in several layers, interspersed with firewood. They were doused with fuel and set on fire. The smoke and smell of burning bodies wafted through the camp. Although the area was hidden, the other prisoners knew something was happening there. The Sonderkommando worked non-stop, long shifts, no breaks, no contact with the outside world. They ate and slept in nearby barracks, watched day and night by guards. The group was not fixed. Every so often, the SS executed all its members and replaced them with new prisoners selected from among the new arrivals. It was a continuous cycle. This eliminated witnesses and prevented emotional ties. No one survived long in that unit. Rotation guaranteed silence. In addition to working with the bodies, they also had to clean the cells, wash the floors, and ventilate the rooms so that the next group would find no signs of what had happened. Buckets of water, brooms, and rags were used. Time was limited. Every mistake was punished. The goal was to keep the process running uninterrupted. The Sonderkommando also assisted in the storage of recovered objects. Some were taken to the sorting barracks, others directly to the SS warehouses. Some were forced to write lists or pack the items. Everything was done under threat. Every prisoner knew their life hung in the balance. The SS officers overseeing this work were meticulous. They checked everything, ordered executions, and measured the group's performance. There was no room for error. The rules were strict. Instructions were given in hushed tones, but they were absolute. The slightest mistake ended with a shot in the back of the head. Members of the Sonderkommando were not allowed to communicate with other prisoners in the camp. Their isolation was total. They were not allowed to leave Camp 3 except under escort. They lived in a world apart, knowing that sooner or later they would be eliminated. That knowledge weighed heavily on them every day, but there was no option for refusal. Surviving a few weeks was already an achievement. The routine was always the same. Entry into the chambers after the execution, removal of the bodies, inspection of the bodies, transfer, cremation or burial, cleaning, preparation for the next group. There were no breaks. Even at night you could hear the orders, the footsteps, the engine running. It was a non-stop death factory. Despite the constant terror, some members tried to maintain their sanity. They supported each other, shared food, and spoke in low voices when unguarded. Others shut down completely, acting on automatic impulse. Some wept silently. No one emerged unscathed. The damage was deep and permanent. Some Sonderkommando kept small objects as mementos or proof, risking their lives. Fragments of letters, medals, photographs. These objects were of no use in escape or survival, but they helped them maintain the idea that they were human. It was a minimal form of personal resistance. The SS couldn't control everything. On several occasions, members of the group attempted suicide. They hung themselves, threw themselves against the fence, or provoked the guards into killing them. They preferred to die quickly rather than continue this routine. The officers knew this and maintained extra vigilance to prevent it, not out of compassion but to avoid disrupting the camp's operations. There were also those who attempted some form of sabotage. They damaged tools, slowed down the process, hid important objects. These were small but risky gestures. If discovered, execution was immediate. There was no trial or warning. Discipline within the Sonderkommando was stricter than in any other sector of the camp. Prisoners arriving at Sobibor didn't know this unit existed. Everything was hidden. The tube, the covered fences, and the isolation served as a perfect barrier. Only by being inside Camp 3 did one understand what was really going on. But by then, there was no way out. Those who worked there knew too much. That's why they were frequently eliminated. Life expectancy within the Sonderkommando was measured in weeks. Some lasted days. Very few lasted more than a month. The SS maintained this pace to avoid complications. No one was allowed time to think, plan, or talk too much. Fear was the primary tool of control. Each death reinforced the obedience of the others. Despite everything, several former members of the Sonderkommando survived and recounted what they saw. Their testimonies were key to reconstructing the inner workings of Sobibor. They spoke of the entire process, of the details that weren't recorded on paper, of the names of officers, of the techniques used to deceive the victims. Many did so out of guilt. They felt responsible, even though they weren't. Others were never able to speak. The weight of what they experienced was too much. But thanks to those who did speak, we were able to understand how the camp operated from the inside. Without those accounts, everything would have remained mere numbers. The horror would have been just a statistic. The Sonderkommando was a central part of the extermination system. Without them, the process would not have worked as effectively as it did. They were victims forced to collaborate in their own destruction. Their existence reveals the extent to which the SS had planned every aspect, every task, every death. Unjustified punishments and deaths in front of everyone. At Sobibor, the punishment system was part of the total control exercised by the SS. Any act perceived as disobedience, hesitation, or weakness was punished swiftly and cruelly. Executions were frequent and used as examples to instill fear. It didn't matter how small the mistake was or how unintentional it was, the response was always extreme. Prisoners knew that any misinterpreted movement could result in death. If someone stepped out of line, spoke out of turn, or looked at a guard the wrong way, they could be beaten or shot on the spot. There was no room for explanations. The guards' authority was total, and they didn't need to justify their decisions. Violence was applied immediately. Guns, rifle butts, whips, or simply blows with the bare hands were used. Sometimes the victim was executed in front of others, so everyone could see the consequences. Other times they were dragged out of the camp and never seen again. The message was clear. No one was safe. The punishment system followed no written rules. It was arbitrary. Some officers decided to kill a prisoner for being dirty, walking slowly, or not obeying an order immediately. Others did it for fun or boredom. Impunity was total. There were no defense mechanisms. Each person's life depended on the mood of the guard on duty. Labor prisoners, including those in the Sonderkommando, were especially closely watched. If one fell to the ground, became ill, or showed weakness, they were eliminated. A worker was not allowed to become a problem. The SS preferred to replace them with another newcomer rather than waste time treating or caring for them. Executions were also used to punish escape attempts or suspicions of collaboration with the resistance. Although few managed to escape, even a rumor was enough to trigger collective reprisals. In some cases, several prisoners were shot as punishment for a failed escape attempt by just one. Collective punishment was used as a deterrent. There was a designated shooting location near Camp 3. The victims were taken there, sometimes in groups, and forced to dig their own graves before being executed. Others were simply shot next to the open graves without warning. It was a quick and efficient method. The Sonderkommando then covered the bodies. Some executions took place in the middle of the camp in front of everyone. The prisoners were ordered to line up and watch. The condemned man was brought to the center, read a false plea, and shot in the head. The body remained there for hours as a warning. Then it was removed without ceremony. No one was allowed to look too long. The Jewish population forced to work for the SS also suffered lesser punishments, such as daily beatings, degrading tasks, or food deprivation. Starvation was used as a tool of control. If anyone asked for more rations or complained, they were beaten or sent directly to the tube. Obedience was required to be absolute. Some officers had favorite methods. One used his baton to indicate whom to kill that day. Another forced the prisoners to sing while they worked, and if anyone sang out of tune, he would beat them unconscious. The routine became a chain of humiliation, threats, and constant physical violence. New prisoners quickly learned that the camp offered no second chances. If they made a mistake, they were punished without explanation. Even silence could be considered provocation. The rules were ever changing. What was permitted one day could cost a life the next. This climate kept everyone in a constant state of fear. Sometimes the SS organized mass punishments. If they found a hidden note, a misplaced tool, or a misplaced piece of clothing, they would round up dozens of prisoners and beat them one by one, or they would leave them in the sun without water for hours. The idea was to break any attempt at internal resistance. No sign of dignity was tolerated. Children were also punished. Although they didn't work, they were used as target practice or forced to witness executions. Women were treated with no more compassion. If one resisted undressing or submitting to the procedure, she was beaten or killed on the spot. Gender offered no protection. Some punishments had a symbolic component. For example, if a prisoner was caught praying, he was forced to repeat his prayer aloud until he fainted, or he was forced to destroy a sacred object. If someone wept over the death of a relative, they were yelled at until they stopped. The goal was to eliminate all emotion. Executions were not only a form of control, but also part of the system of extermination. Each death served as a reminder of the SS's absolute power. A culture of terror was built, where death could come arbitrarily and without warning. Fear maintained order. Silence was mandatory. Even some Ukrainian guards were punished if they disobeyed. If someone showed compassion or made mistakes, they could also be executed. The SS didn't fully trust anyone. Only those who consistently demonstrated cruelty were considered useful. The rest were expendable. Eventually, punishment became part of the camp's daily operations. Not a day went by without beatings, threats, or gunshots. It was part of the landscape. The prisoners didn't know if they would make it to the end of the day alive. Every task could be their last, and everyone knew it. Witnesses of the extermination mechanism. In most of the testimonies, there is a clear desire to accurately detail everything that happened, rather than simply sharing a general overview. As a result, these accounts are valuable both as historical sources and for their emotional impact, as they come from people who went through the process at Sobibor from their arrival to their departure from the camp. Some survivors commented that before leaving for Sobibor, their families had been confined in ghettos for a long time. An example of this is the case of Abraham Margulies, who was part of the last group sent from the Piaski ghetto. His wife was also traveling on the same transport. There were 2 other freight trains prepared for that day, but due to lack of space, they couldn't take everyone. As a result, several people were left behind. According to Margulies, life in the ghetto was very hard, especially because of the lack of food. It was full of orphaned children living among the destroyed houses. Margulies said that, at the time of departure, there was so much panic that he couldn't remember anything in detail. Once on the train, everyone huddled together because of the cold. They were so tightly packed that they couldn't even move, and the screams were constant. They didn't know where they were being taken, but they already feared the worst. Esther Raab recounted that, upon entering the camp, they saw a group of young women peeling potatoes next to a long building. According to her, they all seemed cheerful and well-dressed. Some were even smiling. At the time, she thought the place wasn't as bad as she had imagined. Later, she learned that these women were prisoners selected for forced labor. Their role was to welcome the newly deported, to provide a false sense of calm. According to Raab, when she saw her mother and sister walk past toward the tube, she didn't realize it was a path of no return. She thought she would see them later. Only much later did she understand what that separation truly meant. Feldhendler, one of the organizers of the rebellion, also shared his experience. He recounted how, upon arrival, he was separated from his father at the Lublin station and never saw him again. His group was met at Sobibor by Ukrainian guards and German officers. As soon as they got off the train, they were shouted at to drop everything and form a line. There were barking dogs and soldiers with guns. The men were ordered to walk in one direction and the women in another. Since Feldhendler knew some German, he better understood what was happening. He heard one of the officers say that the elderly and children wouldn't last long. That stuck with him. Most testimonies agree that at first they didn't know what Sobibor was. Some thought they were going to work, others that they would be taken to another ghetto. No one imagined it was an extermination center. Even when they saw the tube, they didn't understand its purpose. The cameras were hidden, and the camp's facade was kept clean and tidy. Only the smells, the screams, and the constant tension made them suspect that something terrible was happening. Henryk Rozovsky mentioned that the German and Ukrainian guards were armed with machine guns and pistols. They also carried wooden or rubber batons. They struck without warning, whether on the head, arms, or legs. He said that a wrong look or a misplaced step was enough to receive a beating. Cruelty was part of everyday life, and many of the blows ended up being fatal. Esther Raab explained that during the first few days, prisoners selected to work inside the camp were constantly watched. They were not allowed to speak to each other or look directly at the guards. If one became ill or could not perform the task, they were immediately replaced and taken to the tube. No one was allowed to rest. The pressure was constant, and the slightest mistake could cost a life. Another survivor, Thomas Blatt, recalled that the Sonderkommando members were isolated in Camp 3. No one from the rest of the camp could communicate with them. Their tasks were known only through rumors. Some knew they transported bodies and burned clothing, but not everyone knew the details. Blatt recounted that on one occasion, he heard a prisoner say he had seen a mountain of corpses behind a fence. This image stayed with him forever. The prisoners lived in constant fear. They slept in barracks where the bunks were so close together that they could barely move. There were no mattresses, only hard boards or a little straw. The cold was unbearable, and in summer the heat was stifling. Conditions were so harsh that many died during the night. If someone screamed in their sleep, they would be beaten upon awakening. The food was insufficient. They received a thin soup, some bread, and occasionally a hot drink. They never knew if they would have a ration the next day. Some tried to hide food, but if discovered, they were punished mercilessly. They were often forced to eat the entire ration in seconds, and if they didn't, they lost the rest or were beaten. Women were treated with the same brutality. Some were forced to work in the kitchen, others in the laundry or sorting clothes. If they didn't comply, they were executed. There were also recorded cases in which they were sexually abused by the guards. If they resisted, they were killed. There was no protection for anyone. One of the hardest moments for many prisoners was watching their relatives disappear down the tube. Some tried to hug them but were forcibly separated. They knew they would never see them again. Screams were common. Many tried to calm their children, saying they would see each other later, but deep down they knew it was a lie. Personal belongings were immediately confiscated. The guards searched every package, suitcase or bag. They took watches, rings, necklaces, money and documents. Nothing was returned. The prisoners were stripped of all belongings and all identities. From that moment on, they counted as just another number. The atmosphere was thick with death. It was felt in the smell, in the sounds, in the gaze of those who had been there longer. No one spoke out loud. People whispered, avoided eye contact, and walked with their heads bowed. The tension was constant. Every day could be their last, and everyone knew it. The revolt, when the prisoners decided to attack. On October 14, 1943, a rebellion broke out at Sobibor, successfully disrupting the camp's operations. At the time, approximately 600 inmates were interned there. During the course of the day, a group of them managed to discreetly eliminate 12 members of the camp staff. Shortly after, a mass breakout was organized. Nearly 300 prisoners were successfully forced out. About 50 managed to escape permanently. This action marked the beginning of the closure of Sobibor. Preparations for the uprising had begun weeks earlier. Among the organizers were Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew with experience in community leadership, and Alexander Pachersky, a Soviet prisoner of war. Pachersky had arrived at Sobibor in September 1943 with a group of captured soldiers. From the beginning, he stood out for his determination. The plan was devised in secret. The organizers knew they couldn't defeat the guards in an open confrontation. Therefore, they planned to silently eliminate key officers one by one to weaken the camp's structure. After that, they would gather the prisoners and rush toward the fence. There were mines all around, but they hoped that in the confusion some might survive. During the days leading up to the riot, the participants met in small groups to discuss the details. No one was supposed to know the whole plan, only their part. This prevented betrayals if someone was discovered. Improvised weapons were distributed, hidden knives, work axes, and tools from the workshops. They also prepared hiding places inside the buildings for surprise attacks. The chosen day began like any other. A roll call was taken in the morning. Some of the German officers left the camp to run errands, which reduced the number of guards. At 4 p.m., the signal was given. The first officer was lured into the tailor's workshop under the pretext of a uniform fitting. Once inside, he was attacked and killed with blows to the head. Others followed. In a short time, they managed to eliminate several of the German and Ukrainian guards. However, not all of the targets could be hit. One of the officers noticed something unusual and fired. The alarm was triggered. At that moment, the organizers shouted to the prisoners to run to the main gate. Some didn't know what to do. Others were paralyzed by fear. As the inmates ran, the guards opened fire. Many died near the fences or by stepping on mines. Even so, around 300 managed to cross into the forest. Some were pursued for days and killed. Others managed to hide. Eventually, it is estimated that around 50 survived until the end of the war. After the uprising, the Germans retaliated. They searched the area for the fugitives. They also murdered those who hadn't managed to escape. In the following days, they systematically executed the recaptured prisoners. The camp was almost empty. Shortly after, the SS began dismantling it. The rebellion was a blow to Operation Reinhard. It showed that even under extreme conditions, resistance was possible. For the survivors, it represented a unique opportunity. It also left valuable evidence about the camp's operations. Some of those who escaped later participated as witnesses in the trials of former Sobibor staff members. Alexander Pechersky managed to reach Soviet territory. After the war, he told his story to the authorities. His account was one of the main sources of information about the events of that day. It also inspired books and films. Leon Feldhendler, for his part, arrived in Lublin. He was murdered in 1945 under unclear circumstances. Many consider him a hero. The rebellion was one of the few successful uprisings in Nazi extermination camps. Only at Treblinka did something similar occur. At Auschwitz, there was also an attempt, but on a smaller scale. What happened at Sobibor showed that, even under extreme surveillance and amidst terror, the will to resist did not disappear. Testimonies from participants indicate that the decision to rebel was made not because they believed they could win, but because they did not want to die without a fight. They knew their chances of survival were minimal, but they preferred to try something rather than wait for death in silence. The impact of the uprising reached all the way to Berlin. The Nazi authorities ordered the immediate closure of the camp. The buildings were destroyed, the land was leveled, and trees were planted to conceal what had happened. From then on, Sobibor ceased to exist as an extermination center. Their story was almost erased, but thanks to those who escaped and told their stories, what happened is now known. The end of the field, not the secret. Following the October 1943 uprising, camp officials decided to close Sobibor. German authorities were concerned about prisoner escapes and the possibility of information about what was happening there spreading. The order was to quickly dismantle all facilities and leave the site unrecognizable. The first measure was to eliminate the prisoners who were still alive. Many of those who had not managed to escape during the uprising were murdered in the following days. Some were forced to assist in the demolition process, but were later executed as well. No witnesses were to remain. The gas chambers, barracks, and warehouses were destroyed. The wooden structures were dismantled and burned. The remains were either buried or removed. The railroad tracks leading into the camp were also removed. All traces of the complex were to disappear. To erase any trace of what had once been the field, trees and shrubs were planted. The goal was to make the land look like a part of the forest. Animals were even introduced to the area to reinforce the idea of a natural setting. No one passing by should suspect what had happened. For several weeks, a small group of workers under SS surveillance carried out the cleanup tasks. They dug new graves, moved rubble, and leveled the ground. Some of these prisoners were brought in from other locations and did not know exactly what Sobibor had been. However, they were also killed when the work was completed. The nearby train station was modified. Signs were removed, and the secondary line leading to the camp was disconnected. This eliminated evidence that this site had been part of the deportation network. The intention was to prevent any subsequent reconstruction of events based on the infrastructure. Documents related to the camp were destroyed or transferred to other secret archives. Transport lists, internal reports, and operational orders were hidden or deleted. Nevertheless, some copies survived and later made it possible to reconstruct part of the site's history. After the closure, the officers who had worked at Sobibor were reassigned. Some moved to other camps. Others returned to Germany or participated in other phases of Operation Reinhard. Only a few were arrested at the end of the war. Most managed to escape without consequences. Sobibor site remained abandoned for some time. Archaeological investigations only began years later. Thanks to the testimonies of survivors and the discovery of buried remains, it was possible to determine the exact location of the gas chambers and other key structures. The closure of the camp did not halt the Nazi extermination efforts, but it marked the end of an era. From then on, the regime focused its resources on other fronts. The Sobibor experience was used as a model to conceal other similar crimes. The silence that surrounded it for years was part of that strategy. Today, the site of the camp is a place of remembrance. Monuments have been erected, plaques have been placed, and commemorative events are held. Although the Nazis attempted to erase all traces, the history of Sobibor lives on thanks to the testimony of those who managed to survive and tell their stories. Sobibor didn't end there. After Sobibor was closed, the Nazis attempted to erase all evidence of what had happened there. Trees were planted, the rails were removed, the graves were filled in, and documents were destroyed. For years, there was almost total silence about the camp. Only a few people knew of its existence. It didn't even appear on official maps. After the war, the site was largely ignored. There were no immediate investigations or efforts to recover what had happened. Only with the passage of time did some survivors begin to speak out. Thanks to their testimonies, the reconstruction of what Sobibor had been like began. One of the first to tell his story was Thomas Blatt. After fleeing during the rebellion, he managed to survive and later recounted his experiences in several countries. He also collaborated in investigations and legal proceedings. His account was key in uncovering the details of how the camp operated. Over the following decades, other witnesses followed suit. Some spoke at trials against former Nazi personnel. Others participated in documentaries, books, or conferences. Each testimony contributed a piece to the puzzle. Little by little, the story of Sobibor was pieced together. In the 1970s, the first archaeological excavations began in the area. Researchers found remains of buildings, fragments of personal belongings, and human remains. These findings confirmed many of the survivors' accounts. They also made it possible to pinpoint the exact location of the gas chambers. During this process, rings, coins, buttons, keys, and other items were recovered. Each object was silent proof of the people who had passed through. Many were displayed in museums or used in academic studies. Some relatives of victims were able to recognize belongings or confirm fates. Despite these advances, there was resistance in certain quarters. Some countries avoided further investigation. Others focused more on other camps, such as Auschwitz or Treblinka. Therefore, for a long time, Sobibor was one of the least known Holocaust sites. Over time, a memorial was built on the site of the former camp. Name plaques were placed, symbolic trees were planted, and guided tours were organized. Educational projects were also developed to introduce new generations to the site's history. Several trials against former Sobibor staff members took place in the 1960s. One of the most important was the trial of Karl Frenzel. He was found guilty of his involvement in the mass murders and sentenced to prison. Other defendants were tried in different countries, but many never faced justice. Among the few perpetrators brought to trial were former Ukrainian guards. Some were convicted, while others were declared unfit to stand trial for health reasons. Nevertheless, the proceedings served to record testimony and provide legal evidence of what happened. The memory of Sobibor lived on through the efforts of family members, researchers, and educators. Foundations, digital archives, and traveling exhibitions were established. Films based on the events were also made, such as Escape from the Battle of Sobibor. Sobibor, which gave international visibility to the October 1943 uprising. In recent years, new archaeological excavations have been carried out using advanced technology. The foundations of the gas chambers, hidden pathways, and destroyed barracks have been discovered. This physical evidence confirmed what witnesses had reported and offered new clues about the camp's design and operation. Sobibor was a place designed so that no one would leave alive and so that once it was closed, no trace would remain. Data uncovered over time reveals that more than 170,000 people were murdered there in just a year and a half. They came from countries such as Poland, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Slovakia, and the former Soviet Union. Their names appeared on transport lists that remained lost or hidden for decades. Some documents, such as the Horrifying telegram, confirmed the magnitude of what happened. Despite efforts to eliminate all evidence, subsequent investigations were able to reconstruct what happened. The testimonies of the few who escaped, the trials of those responsible, and the excavations on the grounds offered a clear picture of how this death machine worked. The camp was dismantled, but it never completely disappeared. The names of the perpetrators, the structures of the crime, and the prisoners' resistance are now part of the collective memory. Sobibor is not only a story of destruction, but also of recovered memory. For years, it was absent from accounts of the Holocaust. Today, it is a reminder of what can happen when ideology, bureaucracy, and silence combine. The history of Sobibor was almost completely erased. However, thanks to those who survived, investigated, or sought answers, it was reconstructed. And although the remains of the camp are no longer visible, the evidence exists. The question that opened this documentary, how could such a place remain invisible for so long, now has an answer. It was intentional forgetting, but that forgetting is no longer possible.